My children were aged probably 4, 5, 6, something like that. And as a non-swimmer, I decided very strongly that they were going to learn to swim. I was spending a lot of time sitting by the side of the pool, watching them, marvelling, as I don't swim myself, at A, how fabulous they looked, and B, how on earth did they float? How did they, overcome their fears? And I suppose because I'm a mum, a teacher, I'm running my own business, there is always that anxiety of when am I going to fit in time to do any painting? When am I going to have time to do any drawing? So every opportunity, in actual fact, is an opportunity to draw. And they were my muse, they were my centre of my world. So I very surreptitiously had backs of envelopes in my handbag, and I would sit there scribbling, drawing. And then it didn't take long before, as I watched them, and I looked at the water and I looked at what was going on and I tried to draw it, I realised that this was a fantastic subject. This was a really complicated subject. And I couldn't quite leave it alone. So I took these funny little scribbles off the back of envelopes and biro back to my studio and started to do bigger charcoal drawings of them. And again, found it incredibly difficult. But began to find a way, a bit of a language that would try and make the paintings. As I worked, I realised what was important to me. So the figures, obviously, Will and Eve, with their little armbands and their goggles and their hats, and everything became very wonderful motifs that I wanted to work with. But most importantly at that stage, the only bit of water I was interested in was the water that was holding the children up. So in effect, what I started to do was create little islands where the children were swimming, doing whatever, whether they were under the water, there were lots of underwater stuff, or whether they were just floating and bobbing around. I also became fascinated by where the body was above the water and the distortion of below the water. The body becomes sort of stretched, elongated, distorted, and the skin sort of looks flatter. And what's above the water obviously looks crisp and in proportion. So I began to sort of play with that as well. I suppose, not inevitably, but there is this trap of having really nice drawings and then trying to copy or illustrate what you've got there. And for a while I did that, and then I realised that I couldn't just put the figures in. I couldn't just paint them onto the surface of the painting and then put the water around them. So in the end, I was having to find the figures out of the paint that I was putting on there. So the paint marks, they did refer to swimming pool blue. They had that sort of turquoise transparency, which was really lovely about the quality of the water. But I then also had to make marks which were inventions. They were pure invention about movement. So they were actually playing off one another. So the direction of each mark, the intensity of the colour, the transparency, the way that they propped one another up, the way they overlapped, invented a sense of supporting the figure in the water, a sense of movement across the space. So those marks came and went until there was a little bit of alchemy that happened. And there would be one or two marks that just sort of implied the figure, and perhaps then I would do a drawing and go, right, where is the figure, so that I could then be more confident about where I could then bring out the face or the hand or the head or the foot, wherever it was, to give this sense of the figure being there. The problem solving is the best bit about painting. It never goes to plan. It always becomes something you hadn't anticipated, and it is the surprise which is really, at the end of the day, what I love. So I like the way, at the end of the day, when I produced those particular paintings, they were way beyond what I had expected. They really had captured something about Will and Eve, and that was quite important too. They weren't just any children, it was something about their mannerisms, the way they floated in the water. It wasn't just a generic small child in the water. They came back at me out of the painting. So when I then took them back to the swimming pool, they were doing their practicing, it was like I was looking at my painting. There came a point when the turquoise blue became too obvious. It became too, again, on the verge of illustrative for me. But then I began to turn my attention to other things that were going on in the pool, not just Will and Eve swimming, not just the colour of the swimming pool, but the sound of laughter, the smell of the chlorine. And again, if you sat by a pool, a sort of public swimming pool, it's echoey, noisy, smell of chlorine, it's unbearably hot. And this bright yellow seemed to need to be in the paintings. And it was purely a reference to the sound, the laughter, the echo. So again, the yellow was placed in a way that sort of bounced and reverberated around the painting, lifting the whole painting, but adding this other spatial quality about it. I think with any body of work, there seem to be little chapters within it. And the painting seems to dictate where it's going to go, more than me, more than the artist. It's a sort of interesting relationship between your subject, the painting, and yourself. And the paintings, after a while, I'd finished quite a few of these big paintings. They were great. I thought, great, I'll do some more. And they stopped working. I couldn't keep using the same language. And so no matter how hard I pushed, how repeated, they just wouldn't budge. And I remember going back to the pool and drawing, and I had a whole day working away, and the drawings were awful, absolutely awful. They were awful because I knew everything about that was going on. They didn't tell me anything I didn't already know, and I needed to find out what I didn't know. I needed to see the subject again with fresh eyes. So I started scribbling. It was the last 20 minutes of the day, and I was scribbling, grabbing a felt tip pen, grabbing a biro, and the figures began to sort of just disappear into the scribble, and the scribble sort of layered on top. And there was a little shift. I didn't know at the time that was where it was going to go, but there was something that sort of shifted in that release. So out of desperation, out of scribbling, what you have to do is more scribbling, because if you invent a new language for your work, you've got to become really familiar with it. And I'd become familiar with the other, and I didn't know about this scribbling. I didn't know if it had mileage. I didn't know if it could actually hold up the subject in the way that I anticipated. So I began to work with oil bars. I began to do scribbling on paper. I began to scribble on top of the scribble so much that forms began to appear. And I became very fluent with how that I worked with the work. And then the other extraordinary thing about the scribbling was that I could start to smell the chlorine, feel the heat, feel the water as I began to scribble. And because I'd been scribbling and therefore let go of a lot of conventional ways of working, my access to a different range of colours really, really opened up, and it was exciting. So I think this was the first or second of the scribbling paint, maybe the second scribbling painting, and some of these areas are very, very specifically in response to skin. So although it's water and it's movement, so this yellow line is very much about Will or Eve sort of pushing their arms up in the water, moving, travelling through the water. These areas are this reference to this humid space, this sensation of skin, warm skin underwater. So there's a lot of polishing, layering, rubbing back to get this beautiful, soft, glowing quality. And then these colours through here, again, getting the right tone of that blue to again sort of pop and shimmer so that it just glanced across the edge of the pink, which is really lovely. And these areas of the painting with the yellow, thick yellow, probably 4 or 5 times putting the layers of paint on, just to get the physicality of the arm or body moving in and out of the water. The texture that came about on the paintings is purely the evolution of a painting. masses of corrections in some ways. So there are big lumps of paint in these particular works, really heavily impasto. You know, there's shadows cast by some of the work, by some of the marks there. Tube, you know, just getting the tube and just drawing with the tube. But equally, there are areas where there's just like a diaphanous sort of curtain, transparent curtain. And some of that has come about by, again, another form of correction, where I've scraped back because I realise I want it to be more transparent, more translucent, softer, almost like water on skin. And I've had to technically work out how to do that. So I've been scrubbing and scraping and then mixing up the white paint so that it's very, very transparent, and just pouring it and just sort of paddling it, working with these canvases on the ground so that I can actually sort of pat, wipe, and just reveal just enough of what was there before, a shadow, like a figure disappearing under the water. So this was the first of the 12-foot paintings, and it went through so many changes. I suppose I was getting used to the space. It's directly inspired by my daughter Eve. Again, her gliding under the surface of the water. So essentially it is a big figure in some ways, or the shadow of a big figure. There are lots of memories of previous bits of, or previous images that were there as I was trying it out. But this beautiful big colour, this is rose, that was basically rubbed all over the painting. Just, I spent hours, it felt like, rubbing this colour into this space, and the way that it glowed out of the canvas was extraordinary, really beautiful, gave that feeling that I wanted. There are, again, you can't really see the trial and error that went on. There have been bright yellow stripes of thick paint at one point, were right the way up to the top, and then I quite quickly realised they were dreadful, and they were always down. I could just see the ghost of them down here as well. And so then I had to get a huge palette knife and just scrape them all off, absolutely all of them. Tons of paint just disappeared. But what I was left with was this exquisite sort of, again, ripple, shadow, glow that seemed to give more form to the rose shape, which is exciting, really exciting. The green stripe was really funny to do because firstly I had to get the right green, and as with the other paintings, it's doing a job. It's absolutely pressing the image down. It's sort of holding it in the space. But I had to try and get it in one go. So I had to get a brush big enough and a pot of green big enough and just do this long stripe. Sort of. We had a joke at one point that they were going to put me on a wheelie chair or something and push me along so I didn't have to shuffle. So the green is really, really important too. And again, the double line, not only a double line as in two lines, but the line within a line, again, gives that kind of electric quality to it. It took a long time to resolve this painting, I think because it was the first of its kind. I have piles and piles of A1 studies all about how I was going to resolve the figure, how it was going to work, what the marks were going to be. And probably it took about a year to really, really resolve it alongside other pieces of work as well. But by the time I got to the end of the body of work, all of the paintings, the end of the 4 or 5 years, I felt like I could swim in my paintings. I felt like I had really just jumped in and learned how to kind of move and organise the paintings and become the subject, become part of the subject.